Hi, everyone, and welcome back to New Forum, a research network coordinating the builders of the new internet. And on today's episode, I'm super excited to have with me Larissa Schiavo, an AI policy researcher who delves deep into automation policy while spearheading innovative talent development initiatives. With a background in managing diverse programs and orchestrating impactful events, she collaborates with stakeholders to shape and execute project strategies. Hi, Larissa, I'm happy to have you on.
Thank you so much, Joyce. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, Larissa, I would love to hear more about your journey, especially I know that you're being a producer and you're having a background with studying film and television. How did you end up being interested in the AI field?
One thing that's important to keep in mind is that, at least in the United States, a lot of film and television and video games are often quite closely interwoven. There's like a common talent pool. For example, went through the University of Southern California film program, and oftentimes film students work with video game students and vice versa. So I think that was my like broad introduction. I also broadly like video games, and I enjoy fixing things and figuring out how things work. Um, all through undergrad, my jobs were mostly working on the more technical side of film and television production. So doing all the boring post-production computery type stuff. Um, and it kind of got me thinking at one point in the process when I was around 17 and I started college. Um, One of the kind of most grueling jobs in film production is in the post-production end of film is syncing dialogue to film. Sometimes the dialogue for a movie is recorded separately from the actual filmed footage, so that's sometimes called ADR, or automatic dialogue replacement. And then you have to meticulously edit and sync the dialogue to match the recorded footage. This takes a really long time. This can take hours. On a big movie, this can take weeks. And even when I was very young, I thought, oh, this is sort of bullshit. Like, why is this not automatable? Um, and I got very frustrated very quickly with, I think, this sort of stealing of the technologies that are used in filmmaking, at least on a like day-to-day basis. Um, and interestingly enough, a lot of recent advancements in artificial intelligence have made that part of the film post-production process like almost entirely automatable. For example, I'm finishing a documentary right now, and I was able to think entirely using a AI tool. So, um,
Okay, for somebody who doesn't know a lot about the film industry, does this mean, for example, a scene gets recorded and then the audio gets taken separately onto the scene, or how I would imagine this, especially this that you just described?
yeah. I think one of the best examples I can think of is like a show like Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
Like you've got characters on dragons in wind on cliffs, like recording what they're saying is like basically impossible, like on the actual set, or it's going to sound absolutely terrible because you've got like wind everywhere, or like the person is like doing some really crazy choreography. It's basically impossible to get that dialogue, or to capture like the audio of what they're saying without relying on automatic dialogue replacement, where then the actor will go into a tiny little like phone booth basically in a basement in Burbank, and re-say all of the lines, and then somebody, um, like me when I was in undergrad, will then take like the audio and make it line up with like what was recorded like on set in terms of footage. Um, yeah.
Okay, yeah, interesting, because you would imagine if you did post-production or an AI would do this step, you would think that it would look quite, it's hard to make it look very natural. I would assume, but I think probably you're so advanced with technology that now you can perfect all these little details, like I don't know, a person's like breath when they're speaking, like the little small details. I'm wondering
Yeah.
how, how did your passion for this industry start, and maybe also where does it lie now, like how did it evolve during your time working in this industry?
Yeah, so I think the origin of my passion and interest in film particularly is that I like telling stories. A lot of people think they're very good at telling stories. A lot of people are not very good at telling stories. Um, I'm not the greatest, but I'm not the worst. Um, and yeah, I think that is a bit of a selector, is that if you're good at telling stories, you sort of get told by everyone you meet, oh, you're really good at telling stories. You should probably tell stories for a living. But realistically, in a lot of film and television, it still is not like the main focus, or the focus is instead on doing like a reboot of a very old IP rather than telling like an interesting story. So that's I think where I'm sort of at right now, in the sense of I am currently producing a documentary that I directed and interviewed everybody for. But it is very much a individual endeavor, in the sense that I do not have the backing of a large production company, because it is kind of a risk, and that is kind of, I think, one problem that a lot of people complain about in terms of the film industry, is that there are reboots on top of reboots rather than an interest in like pursuing completely new and untested, or like not market proven like storylines or IPs or things like that.
Gotcha. So, for example, the high school movie drama gets replayed over and over again, and it gets pushed the budget, but then, the new stories kind of have to prove their concept, or like they're not getting pushed to the front. Um, I would say, like, is this the reason also? I mean, we talk a lot about on this podcast about the creative economy and, distributing value to individual creatives. I was thinking, was this also a passion that came up for you and then getting interested in the AI space as well? Or how did you click them with AI so much? Because I think if you come from like um if you're new to AI, crypto, all these things, I feel like it's really um like for me, I personally got interested in it when I first heard about distributing value back to creatives and things like that. But I'm wondering, where did you got into kind of like AI? And um yeah, also you worked for a couple of AI companies before, so I would love to hear more about your interest in that.
Yeah, so my main foray into getting into AI was that um, I worked on a reinforcement learning library, which is basically you make uh, a robot, or you make a computer play video games for thousands of years. I helped make a library that was focused on taking games sort of akin to Atari, but it was called like Gym Retro. So did a bunch of video game, did a bunch of sort of boring, but like in retrospect, quite fun work on getting a bunch of video games playable by AIs for reinforcement learning training.
Okay, interesting.
And that was sort of my, yeah, that was my intro. And then you know, I am really good at teaching myself stuff. Um, like I don't mean to toot my own horn, but that is something I'm good at. Is I want to learn something, I can go out and learn it, and like I am great with like you know
You're you're part of the generation
with that. And so
of the internet, I guess, where we just get
right, exactly. Yeah.
curious, and then we see something, and then you fall into the rabbit hole of wanting to learn something in YouTube. And I feel like that's a great thing about us. Sometimes we can be a bit
Yeah,
bespoke,
exactly.
but you can, yeah, I definitely see that. And also, you mentioned in an article recently that people are what they repeatedly do. Losing what they repeatedly do is a loss of identity. And I want to go there a bit and talk a bit more about the article you wrote and the insights we gain
Oh yeah.
from this, because I found this article really interesting. So can you share insights on how AI like is revolutionizing creativity, um, and the role it will play in the future for these creative industries we're talking about now.
For sure. Yeah. Just to give a little bit of context to viewers or listeners who maybe are not familiar, I read an article called The Luminous Pressure that was sort of a deep dive focused on historical analogies with regards to labor displacement due to technological automation. So, in the article I wrote, I honed in on two advancements in the 19th century, a number of advancements with regards to garment manufacturing and textile manufacturing. So, spinning jennies, power looms, etc., automatic carders, as well as in agriculture, which is where my mom's family background comes from. Is we've been farmers for like 300 years or something like that in Northwest Ohio, and in agriculture in the like mid to early to late 19th century that looked like threshing machines, which are machines that you know replace like a very tedious task of like getting grain out from like wheat. And I think in looking at those two specific historic examples, one really big takeaway is that in the 19th century, but also even today, um, what one's family does and what one does for years, if not decades, is a major driver in identity, right? Like, I mean, in the United States, you still see this a lot with folks who are parts of certain unions or guilds. For example, I'm sure a lot of people on the internet have seen things like, oh, I'm a certified forklift operator, but I think that's actually a really great example of how people take what they do very seriously, right? Like, ironic, like young people like us will be like, haha, certified forklift operator is a very funny t-shirt to like have, right? Like, but people do take a tremendous amount of pride in the fact that they are certified forklift operators, perhaps outside of ironic internet bubbles, but um, being able to consider like that aspect of job as identity is, you know, still as present as it was when people were picking surnames like 500 years ago and going off of like, oh, I'm the Miller, I'll pick Miller. So
Yeah, it's an important, like, I feel like our life without our work, like, where, life, obviously we have a purpose, and I feel like work obviously plays a big part, or like looking for where we fit into this world, and
yeah,
I feel like this is something that is really interesting, because I feel like, especially with our generation, sometimes you see kind of this lost direction, a lot of people you have so many opportunities, you have all the tools in the world, but then, it's really hard to find that identity when there's so much noise going on as well. So you have to stay really focused. But then there's another thing where, yeah, like you just mentioned, back then we had these craft that we learned for all of our lives, right? Like for 20, 30 years, we've been, if you've been into, I don't know, forklifting or anything, like a farmer,
right.
you've been doing that for so many years. So that is just a thing that, first of all, you practice, and then it becomes your identity and what you've known for in the culture. But now it's almost like you have, so many areas you can dabble into, and as well as like something I always, obviously working within the creative industries myself, and you coming from the film industry, is like the creativity, right? Like the only thing right now, or that is really, if we take away all these things that we have to do, like we have to make clothes, we have to cook, we have to do all these things. If we take all of that away, what we are left with is kind of like creativity. But in a way, this is also a bit taken away from us, because there's so much. I want to go a bit deeper on there. Like, what do you think about, um is how is AI impacting this in the future? Because for me currently, I feel like when I'm write something, or when I do any creative, like editing videos, anything creative, I feel like everything has been done before, and I don't really get my creative juices flowing like I did maybe when I was 14 or 15, and new to the internet. So I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Another historical analogy I like to hone in on, in that I am really a fan of because I come from this part of the United States, is I'm really interested in I think the advent of assembly line manufacturing in the United States, because what that meant is suddenly people went from, I think at the original, like Henry Ford's original car plant, the Marquette plant, people worked 14, 12 hours a day, right? Uh, Pretty much every single day of the week, with the exception of Sundays, so people could go to church. With the advent of the assembly line, that fell to 8. Um, and this is in the span of like less than 10 years. People went from they slept, they went to work, that's it, to they slept, they went to work, and then they had all this extra time as well as weekends. And at the turn of the 20th century, there was a interest in hobbies as a means of like, oh, what are we going to get people to do, right?
Yeah.
This is also um, coincides with prohibition, where a lot of people were saying, oh my God, these people who are responsible for caring for women and children who at that time largely could not work or could only work very poorly paid jobs were in the hands of people who, for fun, they were like, well, I'll just go get completely plastered at the bar because that's all I
Yeah.
can do.
Yeah.
Um, and so the advent of sort of hobbies as a cultural phenomenon was a very big deal. And I think it's an interesting kind of it's an interesting case study because you can find magazines from this time talking about hobbies. Like, oh, have you considered taking up a hobby rather than, drinking your entire paycheck away like every Friday? And I think that's a very apt comparison, is rather than say, you know, I'm sure your parents probably have like hobbies, right? Because that's I've noticed a lot of like boomers and older generations tend to come from this like, oh, I work 8 hours and then I go home mentality, versus like I feel like with us, like, oh my God, like I need to be on that grind like until I fall asleep, right? But we sort of return to this like I work, I sleep, I work, I sleep type
Yeah.
mentality. But so I think we're going to start to see people not returning to the exact same hobbies, right? Like I don't think people are going to take up like model trains or things like that because it's very space intensive, right? But I do certainly think that we will probably start to see more of a leisure society. One hypothesis I have is that um, things like antiquing or collecting of commonly used objects, so vintage clothing, for example, I think is a great example of like, oh, this is something I have to do. You can't not wear clothes, but it's also like rather labor intensive but fun, and
Yeah.
others can find value from it, right? Like I owe a tremendous debt to all the wonderful ladies and gentlemen on Depop who go through the Goodwill racks for me
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
find
Yeah.
all the cool sweaters. um right, I think there's probably going to be a bit of a shift towards like not quite a leisure society, but a like, yes, I understand that like the hours don't necessarily pencil out, but I'm having fun, so it's fine anyways, kind of like secondary jobs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense with what I've been experiencing and a lot of people been experiencing, you know? It's more, I feel like it's turning more into like a gig society, which obviously has a lot of pros and a lot of cons then as well. I feel like my parents were saying this the other day, today, oh, when how are you gonna get all these, like how are you doing this job like online, and how is all of this working, and are you not applying for jobs, like you send in your CV, and and I'm like, Mom, like you're so like this is so over, about in especially I'm German, so everything in Germany is always like, in that way, and we have to do it that way.
Yeah,
And if you don't have your CV sent out, and you don't go to the so it's super interesting to watch, but obviously I'm very grateful to be part of this, but I'm also curious to see what comes out, because it can breed also a lot of, like, I see a lot of people my age now being like creators or being, into content, and there's like no structure at all to doing this new thing. And it's kind of like I said, I used to go on the internet to escape kind of like, life and school and, find my films and find my videos. And now it's all kind of like mashed up in being online 24/7, creating 24/7. And I don't know, like it's interesting to see. And especially for like, we've used to think always about industries. Okay, this is the music industry, this is the fashion industry, this is the film industry. I feel like now it's almost coming together. Um, how what are some of your strategies, for your everyday life you could recommend to maybe embrace new technologies and, but also keep your artistic visions and your expression and everything, to keep you grounded. What do you recommend there? Or how do you approach this?
Yeah, so I think something that I really like is when I was a kid, so I'm half American Midwestern, half Brazilian. Um, Brazil has a crazy tariff on computers. It's if you were to like do like a back of the envelope calculation, it would be like if you or I, if a MacBook Pro, like a base model MacBook Pro, was like $30,000. That is how extreme tariffs are in a lot of Latin America for technology, for laptops, smartphones, etc. And so when I was growing up, computers were like this almost holy relic. And I think this is probably true for a lot of other, people who have ties to Latin America. Like a laptop is like not just a laptop. It's like it's basically as if it were like $30,000.
Yeah.
That is how expensive they are, taking everything into account. And so computers have this sort of like very special reverence. And it's often one of the first things that like when Argentinians or Brazilians come to the States, they'll often be like, okay, first stop is we need to like go to like the like Apple Store or Best Buy or something. And they'll
Yeah.
have like a laundry list of things that people have requested, right? And then they'll like bring that all back. And so when I was growing up, I kind of computers were sort of this like, oh wow, a computer, like that's very important, that's very expensive. And now I see all these because I speak a little bit of Portuguese, I can enjoy the Portuguese internet or the Brazilian internet. And it's a very different kind of culture of appreciating online media, right? Like there's a joke of like people in Brazil saying like, oh, come to Brazil on like every single artist. Like, and I think that it's just like a very enthusiastic kind of internet culture.
Yeah.
And it's something that I sometimes forget when I'm too much in the English internet, right? It's like, oh, of course we have computers. Of course, like computers is computers versus like, oh yeah, well, I'm just gonna ask Lady Gaga directly, like on the YouTube comments, like come to Brazil. Like I'm going to like, talk directly to all these people that I really like. It's great. I like that a lot. And I think there's also like a tremendous amount of like Brazilian talent in terms of like DJs, in terms of like online creators, because there is a bit of a different attitude, I think, fundamentally towards technology. Like I I'm very positive that some probably the best producer, like music producer in the world right now is probably like a 13-year-old in Brazil.
Come
That is
on.
my
Shout out to all the Brazilian. I mean, I know a couple. Rorschach and stuff. He's really popular right now over here in
yeah,
Europe. And also I have Brazilian friends and they're really savvy with computers. Like they're really into computers, and it makes sense because you grew up, you have that different appreciation for what the internet is, and like yeah, I totally understand that.
yeah. So I think sometimes getting out of like your local bubble or your like national bubble or even your sort of like language bubble can sometimes help.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of just taking a new approach or thinking of like things differently, because as an American, I have a different material culture than somebody in the Philippines, for example, right?
Yeah, definitely. On 100%. And I think this is great. Like this is like I just came from a writing camp actually, with
Oh,
30,
cool.
30 artists. And it was so nice to just see everyone's different approach to creativity, right? It was more writing music, but um it was so refreshing to have that coming together actually. And I was like, oh wow, great. Like we should have definitely make more of use of these creative hubs and, coming together and doing stuff like that. And it gives you perspective as well, and I'm wondering when it comes to AI, and you being involved within the space, from your experience, what are some of the key things that matter to you when building AI systems and using them as well? Like, do you, I mean, I rely a lot on ChatGPT these days, for some stuff. Don't tell anyone, but I'm wondering how do we ensure that, for example, in the film industry, this doesn't get, where everyone has the same script coming out, or is that even a problem? I don't know. What do you think about this? Is this a problem, or should we think about this?
Yeah, so one of my best friends in the entire world ran the Writers Guild strike at the Fox lot in Los Angeles. And during the strike, I went down to support her and show, hey, you know what? I think it's great that, you're taking a stand for this, and that, and in the United States specifically, organized labor kind of took a big hit over the last like 50 years or so. And film is actually one of the few places where guilds, unions, etc., labor organizations are still very strong, very, very strong. You cannot cross this picket line. Like if you do, it's going to look really ugly. Or if you break some of these agreements, it'll be really bad. Like, and so I think with regards to making sure that people are sort of paid or treated fairly, I think it's important to not break those agreements. So, for example, there's a horror movie recently that did break one of these one of the agreements that ended the Writers Guild strike, which is to if you use something that's AI generated in a movie, like on the screen, you have to note it. They did not do that. It resulted in a lot of very ugly publicity for the movie. And as a result, the people who made that movie, or at least the higher ups who made that movie, are probably going to run into issues working with others down the line. And so I would say, whatever you do with regards to AI, like just please do not, like it is not worth it to like, if you're working in film, nothing is worth like losing access to some of the most like talented and experienced creatives, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in many cases, using AI generated material um, can result in you like breaking that agreement, and you will more or less like not get as many people excited to work with you. So from my perspective, as an American, that's like what I would definitely raise a caution against. But I do think one thing that I am constantly like running into is that like the tedium. Okay, so quick briefer. So if you look at a big movie like a Marvel movie or something, and you sit through the credits, right? You'll see like, oh, here's the producers, here's like the extras, here's all these sort of writers, blah blah blah, and then you'll see the VFX departments show up in the credits, right? And the VFX departments are like
Hundreds.
just crazy numbers of people,
Yeah.
hundreds of people, if not maybe thousands of people, right? One area, and it's interesting. So VFX is one of the few areas in film where there isn't very much guild or union representation, right? I think in some cases they'll be covered by like a talent agency or something like that, which can help them advocate for better rates or better payment. But in many cases, it is not like as strongly union as they
As the,
writers or directors.
okay.
Yeah, and so you'll see. I've noticed there is a lot of AI advancement in terms of like VFX specific tools that are AI based in VFX versus in like editing or things like that, where there's sometimes local laws that even prevent you from using AI transcribing tools. But in VFX, I think there's a lot that can be done and maybe a lot that should be done, because in many cases, it's a lot of VFX artists are not working in you know the wonderful conditions that editors are working in, where it's like, oh, you get paid, you get lunch, you get breaks, blah blah blah, and you're getting paid into like a health insurance package or something like that. It's more like, oh, we're outsourcing this to a country where there's laxer labor regulations and things like that.
So we just talked
Yeah.
about, I think you mentioned what are the effects called?
VFX, so visual effects, so computer graphics, like, yeah.
So anything, so I would imagine like transitions or some visual kind of things that are put onto movies, or how's that?
Basically, like, probably everyone who's watching this or listening has probably seen Lord of the Rings. So like Smeagol is like VFX.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
okay, so
yeah,
everything visually kind of okay, gotcha. And
yeah,
yeah, so you think that that AI is actually helping the workers within this space to enhance their jobs, and because they're not so protected, right? That was the
yeah. I think it's, I don't know if it's necessarily helping the workers, but I do think it is like greatly reducing the amount of labor required, as well as like potentially making it easier to say, oh, we're going to hire a VFX team based in, you know, Canada or based in, Mexico or something along those lines, versus like we're going to have a VFX team based in question mark, we actually don't know, which isn't as uncommon as one might think. Sometimes it's a little bit shadowy, a little bit like you don't, in some cases, it's not that uncommon to outsource to like a huge um, outfit in Eastern Asia where um, they could in turn be outsourcing as well. It's a very complicated system involving a lot of handing things off to different studios, some of whom aren't necessarily like bound by US, Canadian, European kind of labor laws, if that makes
okay.
sense.
Yeah, makes sense. Like more some freelancers that might be in different countries, and it's a bit more difficult to have your hands on regulation. So I'm wondering from hearing all of this, there was a thing I think that was during COVID where it was like, oh, actors are all gonna lose their jobs because AI is gonna replace them. And it's getting more and more actually where even DJs and everything can be replaced by AI, like their voices, their music. And I know that it's in a gray zone of legal things, I think, regulations around it. So are you actually scared of that happening, or are you still like in the mindset of like actually just looking at this as a positive thing, using AI to collaborate and make new things? Because for me, I'm thinking, if I'm an artist and then somebody just dropped a freestyle of me saying some weird things, I would be I don't know what I would do about it. But on the other flip side, I'm thinking if I want to make a movie and I can use AI, let's say an animation movie, which is like when I grew up, yeah, watching Disney and Pixar and all that stuff, that was a job that was maybe unattainable for me, because you have to go through school, you have to do all these things, you don't have the programs, you don't even know where you would start because it's so expensive. But now you have all these tools, and it might be able to do a fully fleshed out movie if the tools get a bit better. So what do you think, how, looking into the future, are you more on the optimistic side, or um when it comes to AI in the creative industries?
So I don't know if I'm optimistic. Um, I do think that there is the potential for, um, yeah, it's complicated. So I think with animation specifically, using the example you gave, um, I have a few friends who are voice actors, and they basically just do animation, video games, things like that. And I think the parasocial aspect of a lot of creators is very important, right? Like you see actors like Chris Pratt who aren't necessarily good voice actors, right? It's like a whole separate skill set. So Chris Pratt, for example, is a famous actor who's got social media presence, etc., and he's famous for being the funny guy from like Parks and Recreation, but and Guardians of the Galaxy, etc. But he's not necessarily a great voice actor, right? That's a whole separate kind of thing. But he's got this like social media package that comes with it, right? I have a friend who's a voice actor, and he does a lot of like YouTube stuff and a lot of things that very young viewers like. Um, and kind of I suppose in the same sort of like cluster of like interests as like Mr. Beast, etc., right? Where
Yes.
it's yeah, and he was telling me, he was like, yeah, it's kind of heavy because like sometimes I'll get these like 8-year-olds or something like that, like asking me for advice with their friends or like, I'm really sad. He told me this one story where he's like, oh, more and like, what should I do? And he's like, I talk about aliens on YouTube. Like, I talk about fictional aliens on YouTube. Like, I am wholly unprepared for like how people relate to celebrities with whom they have a parasocial relationship. But now he's like trying to, tell a little kid like, oh, please, contact, get help. Like, you're not alone. Like, he's stepping in, kind of becoming this like friend to just random viewers who don't relate to him as an actual friend, but as just a like content creator. And so I think that parasocial aspect, for good or ill, is probably something that you can't really ignore. And I would
Yeah.
be very scared to see like how and or if AI would result in kids like messaging, I don't know, some completely synthetic like
First. Yeah.
person, and then like
Yeah,
it's
it's
difficult.
scary for the person who has like you think you have the responsibility then because you obviously, as the let's say the star or the influencer or the actor, you put these things out there and you get reciprocation, even though you might do it just for fun, but then now you have all this attention and people coming towards you, and I think it can be quite, I mean, I imagine it being quite overwhelming. And then on the other hand, exactly that, like impersonation and, you know, yeah, I think that is something where I'm like really also where I see 8-year olds now having access to all these things and I'm like, is this really like where we want to take these kids? Like, isn't that all but too early? And parents do their best, to have their hands on it, but I feel like there's still not a good, if somebody wants to get their hand on a video game or whatever and they're 8 years old, they will find a way in school to get around it. Or, I'm just, yeah, I feel like I'm so happy that I grew up without a phone, and um,
Yeah,
even like if you think influencers and the impact they have on kids, like if you, okay, like if you're in your 20s and you see that, that can also be detrimental to yourself. But if you're like 14 and you're going through all these things and you see all this stuff online, it can be a lot. um yeah, I think that you're right on this, and it can be a bit scary for both sides, I think. And yeah, internet scams in general, it's so hard to tell, and to, I don't know how even cybersecurity is helping there and how it's really, dissected. But another thing I also learned when getting more into AI is that we had a picture app, so kind of like an Instagram, kind of like a Tumblr, where pictures would be generated from AI, but then it is based on somebody's work, right? So if I look up, okay, I want to create an AI handbag or an AI movie, this is also coming from sources that has been trained into the AI model. And how do you give credits, Obviously, everything kind of is based on an idea that has been there before, but I feel like especially with, you know, movies and stuff like that where it can be so much money or so much upward for somebody to gain. I feel like it's a tricky thing, because these AI models are trained on some sort of imagery or things. Have you thought about that, or have you had a
yeah, it's interesting. I think, yeah, as you mentioned, one of the inherent problems with a lot of AI systems is that they are trained on pre-existing content. They're based on historic data. They're not necessarily based on things that have never existed or things that have never been incorporated into these data sets. So One story I like to tell is I was playing around with a very, 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 very early version of a large language model. Um, and I was talking with the creator and I was like, oh, this is fun. What's it trained on? And he mentioned something along, he was like, oh, there's a lot of data in here from like, you know, AO3, like the fan fiction website. And I was like, oh, okay. So if it's based on AO3, um, it's probably got a great grasp of like, certain fan fiction tropes. And I was like, okay, Spock, exclamation point, Kirk. And viewers, listeners who are familiar with fan fiction will immediately know what this means. And it was very good at recreating a Spock Kirk fan fiction, which absolutely makes sense. But if I were to say, oh, I want to make a fan fiction of like my original character or something like that, that's a wholly different category. And you can only really base it off of tropes that have existed for a very long time, right? Or, for example, I think one thing that's kind of interesting that has existed in fan fiction for a long time, but isn't like quite as representative in data sets is I think queerness and different sorts of gender identities. Like this, it has been a thing for a very long time, but it's not quite as like overwhelming or like just in terms of volume, there isn't quite as much volume to create for like a better like training set with regards to I think queerness or different gender identities, which is still like the volume of work is like much smaller compared to like, oh, I'm a girl, I'm a boy versus like,
Yeah, yeah, definitely,
yeah.
definitely. That is
So
something as well, where and even if you train the model with the new data you have, like let's say in your example with the queer community, for example, in mind, that's still I think a tricky thing to make an accurate picture of, and not be in any way, because that community is still pretty, I would say, like in our age new. So um I don't know if that would be even offensive because I've seen data models before where I was like, okay, this is looking a bit weird, even with like racial like cues and stuff like that, like where they just put together things and I was looking at it and I was like, this just doesn't seem right. So I think that is something where we will all have to work on. I enjoyed this so much, Larissa. I would love to know, like, first of all, I want to know because you work in film. What are like top three movies? Because or like top three movies you would recommend to our listeners. And then second of all, I would love to know um something that you would love to do within the next years or you're working on, and just hearing a bit of an outlook of what we can expect from your journey next.
yeah, so in terms of movies that I would recommend to viewers or listeners, I think I really enjoyed Obama's recent series based on Working by Studs Terkel. It's a great book, but I really enjoyed the series a lot. I think it's a great insight into how people work in America in the present day and how people relate to their work in America in the present day. I thought that was a wonderful movie. In terms of other things, if you haven't seen Pacific Rim recently, I love Guillermo del Toro. Um, complete Guillermo del Toro stan. Like it's everyone I've recommended. I personally love it, but I think people often dismiss it as like a robot movie versus a like movie about you know having complex relationships that are not necessarily romantic with people that you work very closely with. For that reason, I think it's, if anything, a better office comedy or a better office piece of media than The Office or any of these other NBC workplace comedies. Because I feel like to me that rings very true. Um, and then yeah, and then I think another thing that I think is massively underrated and that nobody is thinking about enough is just media from other cultures that you do not understand that you have to use subtitles for. I would say like generally like just checking out, doing a quick Google search saying like, oh, what is the most popular Korean drama in the world right now? And then going and watching that with subtitles. Because I Korean dramas in particular, because they have a particularly strong popularity in China, Japan, etc. In a lot of the non-English speaking world. And I found that a really enlightening process fairly recently, because I just didn't really know anything about it, but then sit down and watching like My Love from Another Star was incredible. It's like it sort of unlocked this whole like, oh, that's why like this particular style is so popular, right?
Yeah, you don't understand it until you try something. Because yeah,
Um, or
um,
something along those lines. It's just interesting to sort of, yeah.
um, okay, sorry. I think I got all of that. Can you still hear me? I'm just checking in because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, I love that because I'm actually so bored with the, variety we're fed sometimes online, with the same old movies you've seen like a million times, and I love your perspective. It's like checking out a new um, you know, food store when you are in another country. You should still check out movies
Right.
and media, because otherwise you're just gonna do the same thing and eat the same kinda. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you so much, Larissa. And then you talked about the documentary that you're working on, right? Is that like the
Yeah.
next project that is coming out?
Yes. So I hope to, I'm shopping around to, I'm finishing the editing process and then shopping it around to different distributors. It's based on, I talked to a bunch of my friends in AI who did stuff during COVID-19, um, that had a disproportionate impact. Not necessarily like, oh, I'm going to single-handedly like do the work of the CDC, but like, oh, huh, okay, so me and a couple of friends who are really good at reading papers really fast are going to get together and make a literature review of like what works with regards to masks, and we're going to talk to a couple of other experts and just kind of cold email them and see what they can contribute. And then it ended up being like one of the most highly cited Nature papers in Nature of all time. Or I have another friend who's like, oh, I'm really, I'm good at wrangling like huge amounts of data. I'm going to make like a blood serum database showing like where in different countries, like what like so valuable that like the UN referenced it in several different cases. Or my favorite example is I have a friend who's very young, very healthy, and very like daredevil. And he was like, you know what? I'm young, I'm healthy, I can get COVID in a laboratory controlled setting. And I think that's like a completely like fine use of my like health and my time.
Wow.
And so he participated in a human challenge trial. And yeah. Um,
Wow. And this
and
is like filmed in a documentary or how wow. That's
yeah,
crazy. That's super interesting.
yeah. So I think the general takeaway is I want people to, you know, be aware of the skills that they have and like the talents that they have. And if you're good with computers, you can do a lot of good in the world, and you don't necessarily just need to like focus on creating shareholder value or,
Yeah.
grinding out at like, yeah.
100%, 100%.
So
I honestly like Larissa, you're such an inspiring woman. Like, just your path and
thank you.
what you're working on. And yeah, I really think this is really inspiring for all the people watching New Forum because they are like obviously always digging deep and yeah, be brave, to venture out into projects and things that, like you said, not necessarily bring any shareholder value, but in the longer term of scheme, that could turn into something amazing for humans or, I think this is a really, really important message. So thank you so much for coming on today. And
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Where can we follow you on socials quickly so we know where we can stay up to date?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I use Twitter a lot. LF Schiavo. So yeah, just first initial, middle initial, last name. I'm the only Larissa Schiavo not in Brazil, so I'm very easy to find.
Amazing. We're gonna link all of Larissa's socials and also the article and her recommendations with movies down below. And thank you so much for tuning into this episode of New Forum. Make sure to like and subscribe, and yeah, stay tuned for more amazing talks and inspiring people. Thank you, Larissa, and I see you guys in the next
Thank you so
episode.
much.
Thank you.
Thanks.